Hi there. Today I want to talk to you out of the book of Ephesians, chapter 4, verse 17, and it says this: "Now this I say and testify in the Lord, that you must no longer walk as the Gentiles do, in the futility of their minds." Now, in the first part of Ephesians chapter 4, Paul tells his readers to walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which they've been called. And in this particular context, that literally means to live in a manner worthy of the calling to which you've been called. Now, he gives us the opposite, and he says, don't live as the Gentiles do. So to understand this, we need to ask ourselves two questions. First of all, who are the Gentiles? And second of all, how do they live? Well, the Greek word for Gentile is ta ethne. That literally means the nations. You can look in the Great Commission where Jesus says, "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations." That's panta ta ethne, all the nations. And so Gentiles and nations are equivalent here. The issue needs to be, first of all, that we define nations properly. Nations does not mean country or political unit. It means ethnic group, really, ethne. Ethnic. You can see the equivalence there. And so we're talking about a people group defined by their culture, by their language, or some other distinctive that's not necessarily just political. So when we look at the Ephesians before the church, they were the Gentiles. They were outside of the covenant relationship with God in the Old Testament. But when this new covenant came along and the church was its recipient, then now everything outside of the church, or every people group outside of the church, are considered the Gentiles. And so Paul is telling the Ephesians, don't live like those outside of the church live. Don't live like your culture. And so now we need to ask ourselves, how does our culture live so that we don't walk in that? Well, friends, our culture is independent, it is isolated, and depending on somebody else is considered a sign of weakness. It's often taboo. We have this live in a moment mentality where we want, first of all, to gain as much as we can for ourselves so that we can experience the most pleasure and happiness for ourselves. Well, you can see how that would lead to sin, how that can lead to drunkenness, or alcoholism, or sexual promiscuity, or greed, or gluttony, or waste. You can see how that leads to sin. And that's really how our culture is. We really have an emphasis on self and not on others. And then to the extent that we do have an emphasis on other, it's very humanistic, where our emphasis is on ourselves as a human race, instead of on the Creator and the Redeemer of that fallen human race. And so we're a very selfish and self-oriented people in this culture. And Paul calls this living in the futility of their own minds. That's the Gentiles. They live in the futility of their own minds. It doesn't get us anywhere. It's futile to live in that manner or to walk in that manner. It doesn't get us anywhere. But Paul is calling his readers to walk in a certain manner, not in that manner that doesn't get us anywhere, but walk in a manner that gets us to God. Now, we know we're not saved by our works, and that's not what we're talking about here, but this is a manner worthy of the calling to which we've been called, worthy of the fact that God has called us to Himself. So here's a couple of applications. First of all, we need to reprioritize ourselves. Instead of prioritizing ourselves and our stuff and our houses and our 401ks and our retirement accounts, we've got to stop prioritizing that. We need to prioritize what God prioritizes. We need to place priority on doing good for the sake of God's kingdom and making God known, rather than just doing good to make ourselves feel better, or because we as a human race have to stick together in this life. We need to repent of any of the things that we do that are culturally acceptable, maybe culturally expected, but that don't align with what God has called us to do. If we drink socially and that has led to drunkenness, we need to repent of that, and we need to step away from that. If we have any degree of sexual promiscuity or immorality, we've got to step away from that. We've got to turn away from that, because that is culturally acceptable, but not biblically acceptable. It's not acceptable to God. So we've got to turn away and repent from some of those culturalisms. But second, we need to be continuously on guard that our culture is not infiltrating us. Turning on a television and watching a television program seems like a pretty innocuous and harmless thing to do. But you know what? Any primetime television show that you watch is more than likely going to have sexual promiscuity all through it. It's going to have drug and alcohol use all through it. It's going to have violence and anger and hatred all through it. And so we've got to be careful that that doesn't infiltrate us and we don't start imitating that. We need to imitate Christ, not our culture. Remember, you've got an enemy who's going to use your culture against you. Our culture is the combination of all the sinfulness of man combined together. And so we've got to be very, very careful not to let that infiltrate us. But that doesn't mean we don't need to isolate ourselves from our culture, because two things will happen when we do. Number one, we're not going to be able to impact that culture. But number two, we're not going to know that culture very well to know whether or not we are in fact walking as the Gentiles do. And so let me encourage you to be in the world, but not of it, to use a common cliche. Know your culture, but know it so that you can avoid living like it and live in a manner worthy of the calling to which you've been called. And that is salvation in Jesus Christ. And I hope that you'll do that.